Your generous support makes this ministry possible. Thank you.
Is anyone feeling this lately?
Yes.
Why? Why? Why are you feeling anxious? What's to be anxious over?
Not really anxious, but
Okay, maybe the other little lesser cousin of it called stress. Maybe. Is anyone feeling stressed? A little? Over what? Can you give me some reasons?
lots of stuff happening.
Lots of stuff happening.
Finding a job.
Finding a job. Soccer is stressful. How many goals am I going to get? If I can only get 3, that's very stressful, right?
Can I beat Plesney?
Can I beat Plesney in the amount of points that I can get? Other great burdens that weigh on you, causing you stress and anxiety. Now, we finished our discussion on depression and some of the consequences as seen in suicide. So I kind of, in some ways, this is, again, a bit of a continuation, especially as it relates to some of the ways in which we deal with it. What I want to do is kind of go through, and it's a similar format in terms of some of the ways that I often counsel people that are dealing with stress or anxiety, kind of looking at it from the 3 areas that we looked at in regards to depression. Do you remember the 3 S's of situation being one, sin being another, and sickness? Yeah, I mean, essentially similar realities for people that deal with anxiety or stress. I kind of use the term synonymous, so I might interchange the terms a lot. But essentially, you kind of see a lot of the same problems. People that have what I believe clinical levels of anxiety that are because specific neurological realities that are going on with people, that everything else in life is doing great, and yet there's this unrelenting anxiety, or sometimes for some people, panic that just comes over them for no apparent reason. For some people, I do think it's in very specific connection to issues of sin, spiritual issues, which are upon them, which cause them to feel the anxiety and therefore act in very dishonoring ways before God. I do also think there are situational realities upon people that cause situational anxiety or stress. I think that's where most of you are at this point. Are most of you done your midterms? Is that behind you at this point, at least? You have one today, so one more. So you're kind of still feeling a little bit of that stress. But there's other great stresses of work and family and job and soccer and other great stresses in life. So I can appreciate those situational. So first off, if you remember the issues that we brought up in regards to dealing with depression in terms of sickness, again, some of the relations in terms of that apply to anxiety as well. Knowing again how we are made, and if you remember from Intro to Psych, all these wonderful terminologies that at this point you've memorized, right? You just bring it up in daily conversation with people, I'm sure, right? You just, hey, have you heard about your myelin sheath lately? And you just kind of bring it. Of course you do, right? Okay. If you look at those dendrites a little more specifically and those neurotransmitters, we talked about some of them, and we stopped at the serotonin. I've added one in terms of relation to anxiety, and that's GABA. GABA is another neurotransmitter that plays a significant role in people that are struggling with anxiety or panic disorders. It's another neurotransmitter. It's an important role in regulating neuronal excitability throughout the nervous systems. It's a big way of saying that for people that clinically struggle with anxiety, it's not that they're not getting enough of certain neurotransmitters. Almost for some of them, they're getting too much. Let me show you an example of that. If you remember, this is what a person who's depressed, you remember what these scans are called? PET scans. They're not pictures of your dog. They're positron emission tomography. The idea is that they inject certain dyes, radiated dyes, into a brain to see where the brain is functioning and where it's not. For a person that's depressed, well, a person that's not depressed, you can see over here is the areas are lit up pretty well. A person who is depressed, it's just not working nearly as well. It's not lit up in the same ways. Now compare that with this person. OCD is known as what? Obsessive compulsive disorder, which is classified under the anxiety disorders. It's a consideration of, generally, how do you describe someone that has OCD? So one compulsion is cleaning. Other things that you know?
Organizing how things are set has to be the same.
Very organized, right? Has to go through certain repetitions all the time, right? When I come into a classroom, I have to turn the knob 3 times right, once left, or something like that I have to do that. If I don't, OCD, obsessions and compulsions. Obsessions are more the ways a person thinks. Compulsions are more the actions based off the thinking. It's considered an anxiety disorder because, again, if they don't fulfill the compulsions or the obsessions, a certain amount of stress and anxiety comes in. And when they started taking pictures, you're noticing that it's not so much they don't have enough of certain activity, it's almost that their brain's on high gear all the time, specifically in certain areas that they're going beyond. In a restful state, in a normal state, their brain is literally just on 5th gear. They can't slow down. They can't stop the repetitive thinking that's causing a large amount of anxiety. Has anyone ever seen the TV show Monk, the detective show? He has OCD, and he has to, whenever he comes across antennas, and he has to touch them and do certain things every time. But his OCD also causes his brilliance, that he's this incredible detective who can spot things. It really is the case with a lot of people that struggle with OCD. A lot of times you'll find them to be very fastidious, very organized, overly organized, but they're also genius people. A lot of people think Martin Luther might have been an individual that struggled with it. John Bunyan, you might have heard of a guy named Howard Hughes that struggled with this as well. He was in who did the movie? Leonardo DiCaprio in The Aviator. If you ever saw that movie, it was about Howard Hughes and a lot of his struggles with it. Nevertheless, there are cases, I believe, where it is more of a clinical reality. All right. What's interesting is that the way that you treat with it, and here's the biblical rationale, the way that you treat it, anxiety, is actually similar to how you treat depression. Do you remember what medication specifically you use for depression? There's uptakes, there's serotonin, there's something about an S and an I and an L and an NOP. Do you remember the letters that go? SSRI. Selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. Essentially what we're saying is that in connection with the serotonin, when that's regulated appropriately, the GABA actually gets regulated appropriately as well. You actually can calm a person's brain down. And that to me is one of the specific ways in which you can deal with a clinical case of anxiety. Again, assuming that there are no other situational realities or perhaps sin issues that are implicating this anxiety, assuming that life for the most part is okay. If you remember again, Tommy Nelson in that video that I showed, what caused a lot of his depression and anxiety in his life? The things he loved. It's just he was always on, right? He was always doing more and more, traveling, writing, preaching, everything all the time, that his body just said, sorry, this is too much. It's essentially going too much. Obviously, I believe the best utilization is medication to really help a person that's dealing with that. The other issue of sin, I put the passage in 1 Samuel 18. Do you know this story of Saul and David? Generally speaking, how did Saul feel about David? Not so much. They weren't like best buddies that went and had a latte quite often, right? Generally speaking, they don't like each other. There's this situation where this evil spirit from God comes upon Saul as he's listening to David. And what does he do as he sees David playing his instrument? Throws a spear. Not usually a sign of love, right? He's trying to kill him with the amount of anxiety that is both, I think, spiritual. I think the fact that this demonic influence comes upon him is evidence of his lack of spiritual insight from God. This obviously leads to this anxiety that he has. Two passages that I often deal with when really trying to help people that are dealing with anxiety, mainly because of sinful attitudes or actions in their life. Oftentimes it starts in a way that is more situational, but that leads into sin. And what I usually do is bring up these two passages that I think are incredibly helpful, specifically when people are dealing with stress and anxiety. The first one, Matthew 6:25, tell you, do not be anxious about your life, what you will eat or what you drink, or about your body, but what you will put on. He gives some examples in that passage in Matthew of things that God does. What does God do in that passage? Do you remember the passage well? He takes care of some other things, like what? The birds are there. What does he do for them? Wonderful, right? What else does he do? Say again? He clothes the lilies of the field. That's the same one that you were going to say. So what's the point? If God so cares for birds, I was just in Mrs. Van Dyne's office, a bird just flew right into the window again. Apparently these windows are well known for that. Or maybe it's me at that point. I don't know. It wasn't nearly as big as the other one we saw, but God literally cares for that bird that just ran in the window, who's very disoriented and, kind of feeling a little funny right now. And he cares for all the flowers and the lilies. What's the point that Christ is trying to give to you and I then?
If he cares about them, he'll care about you.
How much more, right? If he cares about birds and grass, how much more for a human being that is made in the very image of God? What you need to do is change your perspective, especially as it relates to things specifically as what you'll eat and where you'll find shelter and how you'll provide clothing and care for you and or your family. You need to realize God's not going to bring you to this point and say, all right, I'm done. You're on your own from here, right? The other great passage that I love is Philippians 4:6. And this is a great passage because it goes through a very specific way in dealing with anxiety. Specifically, what are you to do? According to that passage.
Not worry and pray.
Don't do something and do something. How should you pray?
Thanksgiving.
Now, my question to you, why does Paul, in the midst of the problems and situations that are... Now, if you read it contextually, Paul has already addressed two people in the church, Euodia and Syntyche, and some problems that are going on there, and he says, I want you guys to get along. And then he goes into this discussion. Don't let any anxious thoughts come into your life. Instead, pray with thanksgiving. My question to you, why pray with thanksgiving?
To focus off of the bad things and all the things that God has done.
And so let me ask you, give me a specific example. If you'd be willing to share some anxious, situational, stressful situations in your life right now, what's something that may be causing you guys stress right now in life? School. It's causing you a real anxiety, right? I'm not trying to downplay it, but according to this passage, what should you do in your prayers to God?
Thank him for what he's given me.
Such as?
The opportunity for school.
You can even go to school, right? I tell you, I do this somewhat comically with a lot of students when they come in, they're talking about the anxiety. And I don't want to demean the anxiety or the stress they're going through. I think that's not helpful. But I do want to put it in context. Oh, Mr. Matthew, I got this paper in eschatology, and then I got this other midterm in Romans, and then I got this other paper that I have to do for this other Bible class. And oh my goodness, and it's really stressing me out. And I think, wow, you have to study the Bible. I'm so sorry. Wow, you have to research God's Word. Man, that must be tough. And on top of that, you get 3 meals a day and a place to sleep, and you get to pray before class starts, and you have the fellowship of other saints, and you get to sing songs in chapel. Man, I'll be praying for your struggle. What am I trying to do here?
Show them that it isn't really that bad.
Yeah.
There's so many things going well.
When we consider all the great joys that we are experiencing, and if really our biggest problem is that we have to write a 10-page paper for Doc Fish in eschatology, if that's our biggest stressor in life, we're doing okay. Because that's not really a problem. That's an opportunity when you think about it, right? That we get to study God's Word. And what this verse does for me, when I'm struggling about how am I going to pay the bills, can I be honest with you, in a personal struggle in the Matthew household, how do I pay bills? That causes anxiety in my life. What's something that you can encourage me to as based on Philippians 4? Okay, I'll make it even more specific, okay? How am I going to pay for the gas bill? Can you give me an encouragement? Help me, counsel me in this reality.
Well, be thankful you have a car.
I have a car. I mean, the heating gas. Let me say it that way.
Be thankful you have a house,
Oh, yeah, that's right.
family that you get to share that house with.
And up to this point, what has God been providing? Heat. See, what I'm doing is I'm looking for it, and I'm thinking, my goodness, how am I going to do this? What this verse tells me to do is to look back and remember what God's done. And stop fretting over what hasn't even happened, and be thankful for what He's done. You need to change your perspective. You need to look at it from God's viewpoint. And I would say a majority of people that you're going to counsel, that you're going to help, are coming to you with this type of anxiety and stress. Some will come with a clinical, some will come with a situational. Some, I think, are just missing out on the reality of the goodness of God. And they need your help to get a better perspective. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I'm kind of wondering about when it's actually terrible. When it's like a friend whose father's going to die.
Right. And that's when we're get into the next one, which is more situational. And again, like depression, these are not always separate, okay? And I'm going to talk about that in a little. There's a lot of interrelatedness, that something that is truly a situational anxiety still can lead into sin. That your friend who's really dealing with a terrible circumstance can still have a propensity to let that lead into sin. And we need to challenge them on both levels, right? We need to be careful. But I understand what you're saying. We're going to get to that in a second here. All right? But to me, this is an important, these two passages specifically, I think can be really helpful in your ministry. When people are kind of feeling stressed and anxiety, I love this passage in Philippians especially because of the practicality of looking back in thankfulness rather than looking forward in anxiety. It's a great way to put things in perspective. When I'm struggling with life, the bills to pay, the attitudes of my kids, my marriage, I forget all the good things that I have. That's not to dismiss the struggle, but that's to put the struggle in context. I think that's always good, especially we Western Christians. All right? And I say that very intentionally because I put myself in that as well. We don't like discomfort. And we need to put it in the context that we really are not in a lot of suffering. We need to realize that, universally speaking. All right? With that said, and Heidi brings up a good point, there are some, I believe, situational realities that may cause anxiety as well. I put up these two passages from Daniel. And I don't put them in context because I want you to read first how he's responding. As for me, Daniel, my spirit within me was anxious, and the visions of my head alarmed me. Verse 7:28, chapter 7:28. As for me, Daniel, my thoughts greatly alarmed me. My color changed, but I kept the matter in my heart. Contextually, do you know what Daniel's freaking out about here? Freaking out is a Ben Matthew paraphrase to anxious.
A dream?
Yeah, do you know what dreams?
The ones about end times.
Can you remember any of the specifics? And you're absolutely right. Do you remember any of the specifics of those dreams? What he's seeing? This is after the great statue. This is the beasts, okay? I mean, have you ever seen visual representations of those beasts? Like someone has tried to draw a picture of what Daniel saw. Have you ever seen them before? Maybe I need to add that to the PowerPoint, because they are freaky beasts, all right? I mean, with lions' heads and leopards and wings and teeth and claws, and Daniel seeing all these things, not on a PowerPoint, but like as visions right in front of him. And understandable, they're freaking him out. Now, both contextually and in terms of interpretation, what all these visions mean? Have you taken Daniel, Rev? Have you looked through those passages? Do you know what any of those visions mean, and what it is that God's trying to show Daniel?
He's in control.
Well, specifically the visions. What do they relate to?
Things that are going to happen.
Yeah, specifically what's going to happen.
It's how the world's going to get overtaken in the end.
He's talking about world history, right? He's talking about the incredible, horrific events that are going to come upon not just the world, but specifically on Israel as well. Israel is going to go through an incredible time of destruction and hurt and misery at the hands of many other nations. If you just got a vision saying, oh yeah, by the way, Caitlin, you and your dad and your mom and your family are going to be shot in the head tomorrow, how would you feel? A little stressed, right? Put it in that context. That's how Daniel's feeling. He just got word that his people are going to be under extreme persecution. Does he have a right to feel a little anxious? Yes. And then more so much so that his color changes. He's feeling a little alarmed. I mean, he's freaked out over the situation that is being unfolded to him here. I think Scripture, specifically Daniel, still gives us some encouragement of how to deal with that anxiety when it comes up in a situation. When I, Daniel, had seen the vision, I sought to understand it, and behold, there stood before me one having the appearance of a man. Who is? Sunday school answer. Works. Jesus. Yeah! He goes on. Again, one having the appearance of a man touched me and strengthened me. He said to me, O man, greatly loved, fear not. Peace be with you. Be strong and of good courage. As he spoke to me, I was strengthened and said, let my Lord speak, for you have strengthened me. Did the situations change? No, they didn't. In fact, they're still yet to be fully realized in the eschatology of world events, right? What helped Daniel? What strengthened Daniel, though? The comfort of Christ, the providential care of who Christ is. So again, Heidi, to answer your question, I'm not trying to dismiss the realities of some real horrific situations, but even in those situations, we can find real peace and hope. And that's our job in helping people, is help them see, listen, God's still in control. That doesn't negate the situation, but it gives context and peace in the situation. And that's part of your job. That's part of your joy, in my opinion, that you get to help people kind of see the bigger reality, right? That they're not stuck in the situation that they're dealing with, all right? Like I said before, with depression, these are not three separate, isolated realities that you'll deal with. A lot of times, they're interconnected. That someone may be dealing with a real situational anxiety, but it may lead to areas of sin. And as such, they need to deal with both the situation and the sin. Someone may be in a sin, and it may lead more to some chemical imbalances as well. And we need to deal with both the sin and the sickness. All that to say, it's not always neat and tidy. You may have some interrelatedness here. Nevertheless, the way that we treat people, sickness, talked about this again with depression. I think the issues of medication and SSRIs specifically are of help. With sin, the examples given that we need to have a better perspective, Matthew 6, Philippians 4, and specifically in prayer. And situation, getting a better perspective and faith in God's goodness. The example seen in the life of Daniel. The situation was horrific, but the person of Christ specifically was a help and aid in that anxiety. To me, again, this model I think is very helpful. And again, part of your job is not to assume it's always sin, sickness, or situation, but to ask the questions of why a person is struggling with anxiety at that point. Get curious, find out, ask a lot of questions, so as then to apply one or perhaps many of these treatments in dealing with anxiety.
Is it always a lack of serotonin, or can there be other
When dealing with the medical
anxiety? Yeah, when dealing with medical anxiety, can it be something else besides giving them an SSRI? Like, it just seems like it's so blanket.
Well, again, we're assuming if it's only a medical issue, then yes, giving them medication is a very helpful thing.
But I guess what I'm asking is there other medications than just SSRI? Like, are there other things that could be going on medically speaking that's causing this?
Is there an example that you're trying to give me, or?
No, I'm really just curious.
Yeah, I don't know.
Okay.
Yeah, offhand, I don't know of any other medical reasonings why people. And again, we're assuming that there are no other situational or other sin issues. I mean, I've dealt with people when I've looked in their life, looked at their past, there's not any specific sin issues. There aren't any specific situational realities. They just say, I just feel anxious all the time, and I don't know why. When I hear that, it makes me realize this is much more of a medical-related illness rather than a situational or spiritual issue. And so to me, most research then shows that it's more in line with treatment with an SSRI. Yeah. I don't know of any others, if that's answering your question. I haven't seen it in the literature, at least. Yeah. That's why I do mention the GABA as a specific addition to this discussion on anxiety, because there is a realization that that is one of the other neurotransmitters that is also part of this equation with people that suffer with clinical anxiety. All right? Any questions with any of those? Again, using that same model that we did with depression, to me it's very helpful, but again, not to assume, but to ask the questions to get to the right way, and it may be more than one that you're having to deal with, in which case you're at least doing the work to help deal with that.
Is there anything more going on physiologically with people that suffer from like panic attacks and stuff?
Yeah.
Or is that just the same thing and that kind of medication helps?
It really is. Panic attack is actually like the next level, where it's not just affecting emotional, but it actually then also affects physiological. They'll often talk about heart palpitations, a heaviness on the chest, sweaty palms, flash heat and things like that. Medically speaking, in terms of like there's nothing actually wrong with them, but it's this rush of endorphins, of other chemicals that are based off of this brain kind of being on fifth gear. Yeah, and so it's kind of like the next level. I actually have an article that I'm going to give you that highlights that as well. All right. Any other questions?
I guess kind of along the panic attack line, have you ever heard of anyone saying that, like you said, like there were heat flashes and sweaty palms and stuff, but like feeling like there's needles on them or something like that?
I can't say I've ever dealt with that with somebody, but I've heard of that, kind of like the pins and needles, especially on the fingertips. Or what are you referring to?
Well, when I was younger, I would just like all of a sudden get like where I felt like I was having pins and needles everywhere.
Everywhere, okay. And, you know, the only thing I can correlate to that is what Tommy Nelson said, when he said at times he'd be laying in bed and his whole body, like his wife would massage his legs, and it was like crackling of like electricity. Because it was, for him, they found it was adrenaline was just constantly being pushed through his system, where his whole body was like on fire, he said. It sounds similar to something like that as well. Yeah. Yeah.
Sorry, one last.
No problem.
One last thought. Maybe you already mentioned something similar to this, but is anxiety something that would often lead to depression? Someone who's anxious for a while,
Yeah.
lead into a state of depression. I don't know. It just seems like some of the stuff is kind of similar.
Similar, yeah. In fact, on a clinical level, it's diagnosed as what's known as bipolar. The manic highs and the low depression is similar to this kind of back and forth. I think that can also happen on a spiritual type of reality, where they're so anxious, they're so kind of neglecting the realities of God's faithfulness and goodness, that they get so depressed and they get so despondent. So I think there's both clinical realities as well as situational spiritual realities that are connected. There's a lot of connection between anxiety and depression, to answer your question. So
And is it necessarily like one for the other?
not necessarily. I think anxiety can lead to depression just as much as depression can lead to anxiety. I think that's why they're so interconnected with each other. That's why I kind of treat and deal with both in a very similar vein as well, in terms of the sin, sickness situation kind of way. Yeah, it's a good question. Good questions. Any others?
Is there varying levels to like bipolarness, or is it just kind of?
Bipolar?
Yeah, because you said like that it, like depression and anxiety, it can be like, because it's the manic highs and then it's the really low.
Yeah. Yeah, they're clinically speaking, when you look at what's known as the DSM-4, which is the diagnostic manual for mental health issues, yeah, you will see often different levels of depression. Like there can be what's known as a clinical depression, which is kind of an all-out. There is the, I'm trying to remember the name, the dysthymic, which is kind of a low-grade depression. There's a cyclothymic, which is kind of reoccurring, smaller types of depression. And you can see that with the anxiety scale as well, where there's kind of a minor anxiety, clinical anxiety, then goes to panic attacks, and then other things that are much more concerning, like OCD, which is even a higher level because it then gets into functioning as well. So yeah, there really is gradations that people struggle with, at least on a very clinical level as well. Yeah. If you take abnormal psych, which Dr. Smith is now teaching, you get to kind of get into all that, because it really is fascinating to see how a lot of these things play out on a very clinical level that people may struggle with.